Okay, I'll just do an introduction, then we'll start. So, good morning, good evening for some of you all over the world. Thank you, guys, everybody, for tuning into this first Borneo Mammal Talk series for 2021. And again, I would like to welcome people from Brunei, from Malaysia, from Peninsula, and from UK, Japan, Canada for tuning in today. So basically, Borneo Mammal Club is a community of mammal lovers online, and we all are from different parts of Borneo and different parts of the world, sharing the love of mammals, trying to share as much knowledge as possible and just experiences. So yeah, and my name is Chavez, by the way, and I'm the founder of a local organization called One Stop Borneo Wildlife. And yeah, the objective of the Borneo Mammal Club series is to uh, make everybody love maybe Borneo mammals more and share some cool things. So today we have Charles Francis, who will be talking about bats, the wonders and diversity of bats of Borneo. I've not met him personally yet, but he was one of the first authors as well on the Field Guide to Mammals of Borneo in 1984 or 83, and lots of other mammal books. But Charles, I'll let you introduce yourself better and introduce the talk, and the floor is yours. Good luck. We'll
Okay,
have a
thank you.
we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the session. Okay.
Okay, let me just make sure I can share my screen properly. So let me just rearrange screens. Can somebody let me know if you can see my screen? No,
I can see your screen.
We can see.
Okay, so it's got a picture of the title and my little green dot running around on it. Yep. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you today is a bit about some of the diversity of bats that are found in Borneo. I've been studying bats in Borneo since 1979, so quite a few years. Not every year, of course, during that time. I'm based in Canada. I work for the Canadian Wildlife Service studying birds, so I don't get to go and look at bats all the time. This picture here is of me. Well, most of you probably recognize that site, the Pinnacles in Mulu National Park. That t-shirt was made the first time I went to Mulu in 1984. A friend was making a joke because there had been a big Royal Geographic expedition under the patronage of, I don't know, the Prince of England or something. And so we made a little t-shirt joking about the Temangong of Tuto as our patron for a friend's going to Mulu. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to run through the different groups and types of bats found in Borneo and get myself here. So there are a lot of species of bats in Borneo. Hide that, sorry. And there's almost 100 species currently recognized in Borneo in 9 different families. And so I'm going to walk through these different families. I think every picture in the slideshow is one of my own pictures. So there's a few species I'm missing, so you just won't hear about those ones today. But this is a sample of some of the families. I will go back through these and show you the various species: the fruit bats, the horseshoe bats, the roundleaf bats, false vampire, slit-faced, sheath-tailed, and let's get my controls. The free-tailed bats, bent-wing bats, and then the Vesper bats, or the common bats. So let's plunge into the diversity of Borneo's bats. So the bats that I'll start with are the fruit bats, the Pteropodidae. This is an interesting group of bats that most of them do not echolocate. So many of you know that bats echolocate, or many species of bats echolocate. It's the way they travel, can find their way at night, the way they catch their prey using echolocation calls. But most of the fruit bats fly by vision. They have very good night vision. And as you can tell by those giant eyes that you can see in this particular individual, this is the dog-faced fruit bat or short-nosed fruit bat. There's lots of different common names, but Cynopterus brachiotis is the scientific name. This is a species that my father lived in Malaysia in the early 1980s. And he had one of those big open houses. Now everybody's all sealed up with air conditioning, but those big open houses near a golf course. And these bats would fly in at night, hang up on the curtains, munch their fruit, and leave their pile of droppings and seeds on the floor every morning. And of course, those ones don't generate any new trees because they're in the wrong place. But these bats are very important for ecology because they disperse a lot of seeds, different types of fruit that they eat. This particular bat, you can see these little specks all over his wing, or you might be able to, depending on your screen resolution, where my green dot is running across. These are actually plant seeds that had got caught on the bat when it was feeding, and those seeds will fall off again somewhere and disperse it. I think some of them might actually be fig seeds as well. They eat a lot of figs. Those are very popular fruits for these bats. So this is the Sinopterus brachiotis, the short-nosed fruit bat. Sorry. This is a larger cousin of it, Horsfield's fruit bat. And this is one that I just saw hanging from a branch. This was near the Kinabatangan River. And it's feeding on some sort of fruit. I'm not a great botanist. Sorry, there's some noise in the background. I hope you can still hear me clearly. But this one has much larger teeth than the short-nosed fruit bat. Just a moment, let me see if I can stop some noise. I'll be right back in a sec. Oh, it's okay. I think we're okay. Can people hear me? You can still hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. So these short-nosed fruit bats, both this one and the one we looked at a moment ago, have this distinctive orange collar around the neck. And of course, these big eyes, white edges to the ears. That's a characteristic of the Sinopterus, these dog-faced fruit bats. And as I say, this is the larger species. It still has the white rims on the ears, a less orange color. The males have brighter orange, the females are more yellow. Where do these ones sleep at night? We think of bats in caves. This palm tree that we're looking at here, this one's actually in Thailand, not in Borneo, but close enough, is a home for two little bats. See how these leaves up here are all sticking upright. This one is bent down. The reason it's bent down is because the bats turned it into a tent. They actually bit the edges of these leaves so that the leaves bend down. And here you can see two, or barely make out, depending on your screen size, two fruit bats hanging just at the edge of this tent. So they've created themselves a rain shelter underneath the leaves. And so they're roosting just under a palm. I've seen a number of these short-nosed fruit bats under palm trees like this. This is a related species. It's called Pentheter lucasii. I should have remembered all my English names, but we only use the scientific names when we study them. It's very similar in shape, but it doesn't have the white edges to the ears. It doesn't have the orange color. This one actually usually roosts in caves, but most of the fruit bats, when they roost in a cave, they roost near the entrance to the cave, not in the really deep, dark areas, because they need some light. They don't need much light. They have very good night vision, but they do need some light to see. There's one exception, the Rosettus, but most of them need some light to see. This is a distinctive little bat. It's actually one that I described as a new species in the late 1980s. When I described it, we thought it was a subspecies of a Philippine bat, but somebody did some more genetics work. I'd never seen this Philippine bat. I was just told by the museum expert, it looks the same. Well, it doesn't. It turns out it's quite different. And so this is a species, it's called Megarops albicollis for the white collar. Albi means white, collis means collar. So the scientific name, it's a white colored fruit bat, a little species, so far known from Borneo, been discovered in Brunei and Sarawak and Kalimantan. I don't think anybody's found one in Sabah yet, but I'm sure they occur in Sabah, just haven't been found, and Peninsular Malaysia and Sarawak. So that's the known distribution. Was thought to occur in the Philippines, but when somebody showed me a photo of the matching species from the Philippines and told me about the genetics, I realized, no, they're not even closely related. It's actually a different genus. So this was formerly called Megarops wetmorei, because that's the Philippine one. but now wetmorei in the Philippines is in a different genus, Tenochirus. So it's a very small bat, but quite a nice little bat. Not well known. Many of these fruit bats that feed in the primary rainforest feed in the canopy of the forest, where they're very hard to capture or to see. You need to put nets up high to catch them. The ones I saw in Peninsular Malaysia, we had a net about 30 meters above the ground, hanging from the tall branches of the dipterocarp. I had somebody who was very good with a slingshot to get a rope over the branch that we could haul up our mist net. This is a related bat, Megarops ecaudatus. Ecaudatus means no tail. This one has no tail. I'm showing the other end, of course, the head. They're very pretty bats. Again, a species that's primarily found in the canopy, also in Peninsular Malaysia and Borneo. Excuse me. One of the interesting things about many bats is that often when they fly, they bring their babies with them. This particular one, it's a Megarops ecaudatus, was caught with the baby clinging onto it. The baby's holding onto the mother's nipple, probably drinking milk as the mother flew. She flew into a mist net when she was looking for a fruit tree. I caught her. We got some pictures. It's an old picture, slightly pinkish. It shouldn't be quite so pink, but so it's quite neat to see them with this little tiny baby that is certainly much too small to fly. After bats give birth, they either leave their baby in the roost, so the cave or their hollow tree, or they bring it with them when they feed. And the fruit bats often bring it with them. Probably safer than leaving it in a roost where some predator might find it. This is another distinctive fruit bat, and you can just see the variety of colors. We think of bats as small brown creatures, but we've seen brown, we've seen orange, we've seen white, and this one's got a black cap. It's the black cap fruit bat, Chironax melanocephala, with a nice orange collar. Also a female. You can just see the nipple out of focus here. No baby with it this time, but again, a very small bat. These only weigh, I'm going to say about 20 grams, but I don't have my book in front of me to check, but quite small bats. This one is a very interesting bat. This is Diacoptera spedicius. One of the interesting features about this, and I put a picture of a male as well. So the female with the big nipples on the side, is that several years ago, well, more than 20 years ago, I caught some males that turned out to be producing milk. So they were actually lactating males. Now, their nipples were very small. I don't think they were actually feeding young with that milk, but they were producing milk. My personal explanation or guess is that there was something in their diet that had estrogens in it, some sort of plant estrogens that was messing up their system and causing them to produce milk. But we don't know. There was analyses in the lab done, and it was regular lactating material. They were genuinely producing milk. So very interesting species. Got a nice scientific paper about it, but we don't really know what it means. My personal guess, as I say, is that they eat a lot of fruits, a lot of varieties of fruits. I think a lot of the fruits have defenses to try to protect them from things that eat them and produce these chemicals. And I think sometimes the chemicals in these fruits have strange effects on the bats, but we don't know that. Somebody tried to find some the next year and none of them were lactating the males, so they couldn't follow up on further research. I said that the fruit bats don't echolocate. This particular one is an exception. This is the Rosettus. It does have a type of echolocation, but it's a low frequency echolocation, very different from the insect-eating bats. It's made by clicking their tongue. And this species, so it's not fine enough to catch insects, but good enough to avoid hitting cave walls when you're roosting in a deep, dark cave. So they can use it to navigate in dark areas, but not to catch insects. This one is the barebacked rosette, known from Borneo, Sumatra. Not yet from Peninsular Malaysia, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody finds it there. one of the neat things about bats is that people are still discovering new species every year. There's, excuse me, currently 1,415 species known in the world, and every year that goes up by about 15 or 20 species as people discover new ones. This is a rather fun little small bat, the spotted wing fruit bat. This is an example of sort of a new species discovery. When we looked at the genetics, we realized that the one found in Peninsular Malaysia and the one found in Borneo are actually genetically very distantly related, even though they look very similar. And so they were recognized as two species several years ago, although they actually had a subspecies name, but recognized as a new species. So this cute little bat has been known to roost inside a termite mound. So I was wandering through the forest in Peninsular Malaysia, actually, so this is a peninsular species, and found this hollowed out old termite mound, or ball, actually, the mud made by the termites. I think the bats might even have hollowed it out, but I don't know if they made it themselves or if some other animal hollowed it out. And then the bats all climbed inside. And again, this is what it looks like. The name spotted wing fruit bat is quite obvious. You can see the pink spots on its wing. Now this might look like a starry sky, but this is actually what happens if you use a flash and take a picture of a faraway group of fruit bats roosting on the cave ceiling. I said that they have very good night vision. The eyes reflect lights just like a cat or other nocturnal animals. And so you see all these white dots shining down. If you actually look more closely, oops, I'll get rid of my laser pointer, green dot. This is a nectar bat, the cave nectar bat. So they roost in colonies in caves. They have a long, narrow snout. And just put another view of one. You can see they have a very long tongue. And these, although we call them fruit bats, mostly feed on nectar. They feed on flowers. And the species they most famously feed on is, of course, the durian, Durio. And they are one of the most important pollinators of wild durians, and I think the farmed ones as well, but especially the wild ones, because they travel from tree to tree long distances. So even if an insect pollinates a durian, it's likely to just cross-pollinate different flowers on the same tree or adjacent trees. But the fruit bats are important to keep the genetic diversity so that you don't end up with just clones of all of these trees, that you get the diversity by traveling long distances. In a night, they might travel 30 or 40 kilometers from tree to tree, feeding on different flowers and transferring the pollen. And that helps to maintain the health of the populations of the durian tree, which at least I love eating, and I suspect many of you do. You're Malaysians. Some of you may not. So that's an economically important species. This is another nectar feeding species. I don't know if it ever feeds on durian, but it very much likes banana flowers. This is Macroglossus. This one is a pregnant female. You can see how big her tummy is, the nipples on the side there, ready to give birth soon. Very long, narrow snout, so quite suitable for a lot of long, narrow flowers. It has also a very long tongue. Feeds on nectar, and banana flowers are one of its favorites. Now, our commercial bananas are seedless, so they don't need pollinators, but the wild bananas that were the ancestors that have the genetic diversity that might need if ever a disease gets into the domestic ones, very much depend on pollinators like this to keep their diversity. Excuse me. So this is a bat that I enjoy taking pictures of. Very pretty bat. Again, big eyes, long nose. And they're very agile. This one looks like it's just almost hovering. They can fly up to the banana flower, stop for a moment. They do land when they feed, but they look like they could almost hover in front of it. This is a fruit bat that many of you may have seen and can probably identify if you have, the large flying fox. Unfortunately, they are now very rare. They used to be abundant. I remember seeing over 10,000 fly over the forest near Gomantong Caves in the Kinabatangan 30, 40 years ago. Now I'm lucky to see 3 or 4 in an evening on the Kinabatangan, unfortunately. But these, as you may know, are the largest bats in the world. They can have a wingspan of up to 1.5 meters. And I think they can weigh up to 1 kilogram. So the smallest bat you're going to see in this talk weighs 2 grams. The biggest one, 1 kilogram. So 500 of the smallest ones to get the same as this one fruit bat. And these bats roost on open branches. This picture was taken in Bogor Botanical Gardens on Java, not far from Jakarta. Again, that's a roost that is unfortunately much smaller than it was. This was about 15 years ago when there were quite a few of them there. There were many fewer last time I was there. Unfortunately, they're hunted and they're becoming rare. But these are very important for seed dispersal as well, because they will carry fruits tens of kilometers, drop the seeds, and help to regenerate forests or to spread fruit trees. So now I'm going to move into the insect-eating bats, starting with the horseshoe bats, the Rhinolophidae. How do they get their name, horseshoe bat? Well, if you look closely at this nose here, you'll see it's got a shape like a horseshoe. Those of you who have never ridden horses may have never seen a real horseshoe, but we all know what the shape is. It's this U shape. They have distinctive tall pointy back, and this particular one has flaps on the sides. It's called the trefoil horseshoe bat, Rhinolophus trifoliatus. And so I think it gets that name from these 3 flaps, 1, 2, and then the centerpiece. Why do horseshoe bats have such strange noses? This is part of their echolocation system. So some bats produce the echolocation sounds through their nostrils, and the horseshoe bats are in that category. In fact, all of the bats with these funny big noses, the roundleaf bats as well, other bats echolocate through their mouth. And you can see the difference when they're flying. If you look at my flying photographs, the ones that echolocate through their mouth always have their mouth open when they're flying so that they can see where they're going. Of course, the fruit bats didn't, because they're flying by vision. But this one, we'll see when in the flight picture, if I go back one, the mouth is closed. It doesn't need to open its mouth to echolocate. So the sound comes through the nostrils, which are here. We believe, nobody really knows why the horseshoe bat has the shape of that, but it's sort of like a beam emitter. It's sending the sound forward in a certain pattern. And of course, these are the receivers, like the radar dish for receiving the echoes when they come back. Big, huge ears. So even a very faint echo from a very small target, they could hear when it comes back in. So the different species, I mentioned there were 11 species of horseshoe bats in Borneo. There's probably more. That's how many are recognized now. I expect more may get discovered because there's some in Peninsula that are not yet found in Borneo, but we'll see. Differ in the shape of the horseshoe. They often differ in the echolocation frequency. These bats have a distinctive echolocation call that has a constant frequency component. I don't have pictures of all of the spectrograms, so we won't go into details on echolocation. I'll just tell the different types. But this echolocation is very good at picking up moths and other fluttering insects. When the echo comes back from a moving target, it gets Doppler shifted. And so a sound that might go out comes back, wavy sound based on the flutter pattern of the target. Maybe not as fast. I exaggerated it, of course, and it's so high frequency we can't hear it. It's anywhere from 30 kilohertz up to 180 kilohertz for different species of bats. Young people with really good hearing can hear 20 kilohertz. Old folks like me can hear about 8 kilohertz, and most of you can hear somewhere in between. But the bats, some of them can hear up to 200 kilohertz. This one is lower, I forget the frequency. This is a related species. This is the large woolly bat. Has exactly the same shaped nose as the trefoil bat. Recently, somebody described another species that looks very similar. I don't have a picture, but they named it after me, which I thought was rather fun. So Rhinolophus francesi, or Francis's woolly bat. It looks very similar to this one, but it's smaller. It's the, I'll show you two more here. Again, this is the trefoil bat, the yellow one. This is the lesser woolly bat on the right. And then that previous one was the large woolly bat. And then in between them is the Francis's woolly bat. So 4 species in Borneo of these woolly bats. Very similar shaped nose. And here we see one again flying towards us with the mouth closed because they don't need to open their mouth for echolocation. This is a different species. This is Rhinolophus affinis. An interesting feature in this picture, if you have a good resolution screen, is there's a whole bunch of little bat flies living in the fur. These are insects that are found only on bats. There's quite a few species of them. I haven't studied them, but I suspect every bat has 1 or 2 distinct species. I think some species of bat flies are found on many species of bats. Other species are found only on one particular species of bat. But I'm not an expert on those. But they look like little spiders with wings running around in the fur. Occasionally they'd run onto your skin, but I've never had one bite me. I don't think they care about people. They want to go back to their bat. So this one has a simpler nose leaf. It doesn't have the flaps on the side. Interestingly, this species is found throughout much of Southeast Asia. It's found in Sarawak, but not in Sabah. And I suspect that's genuine. We've done a lot of studies of horseshoe bats in Sabah, never caught the species, even though it's very common elsewhere. So why doesn't it cross the border? Who knows? Maybe they know, but I don't. Here's another picture of one of these Rhinolophus affinis flying towards the camera. This one is what's called the acuminate horseshoe bat. I didn't show, I'm going to go back to, see here there's a join between the back and the front that has a nice rounded area here. If you can see that. This one here has got a pointed area here. It's a fairly large bat, Rhinolophus acuminatus. This is a species, if you ever go to the Kinabatangan Research Station, Batu Girang is it called? No, not Batu, Danau Girang. They're roosting underneath the main house there. There's a big colony under the buildings. That's where I took this picture. That's the floor of the rest house at the research station. This is another one that instead of having a rounded flap between them, has this whole bunch of hairs here. This is Rhinolophus kriegi, Creed's horseshoe bat. This species is very common at Gomantong caves. There's probably 100,000 or 200,000 of them in the cave. If any of you have been to, some of you know about Mulu caves, but for bats, Gomantong caves is equally spectacular, especially if you can spend an evening there watching the bats flying in and out of the cave. This is one of the common species that flies in and out. And here's a picture I took at Gomantong caves with an automatic camera set up. And this bat was so greedy eating insects, you can see its tummy is just bulging full of insects. And it's got so many it can't even fit them all in its mouth. It still has some flying ants sticking out its mouth as it flew back into the cave. So it's a good thing they echolocate through their nose, because there's no way he could echolocate through his mouth right now with such a big mouthful. It's a Creed's horseshoe bat. This one has one of the largest noses and longest ears of any of the horseshoe bats. Philippine horseshoe bat, Rhinolophus philippinensis. Again, common at, well, much less common, but found at Gomantong caves. The size of the nose leaf and the size of the ears is related to the echolocation frequency. The big nose leaf has a low frequency call. Just think of deep bass voices in big men and high treble voices in smaller people. Bats are the same. The small nose leaf has high frequency. They probably are better at catching small insects. So high frequency has better resolution, doesn't go as far, but can pick up smaller insects. The low frequency will travel farther and is good for picking up larger prey. And here's one that was flying back into the cave. It looks like it's doing a nosedive, but I think it was getting ready to fly down low into a cave at Gomantong. And this is a baby that was left hanging up during the day when the mother was out flying around, or actually I should say at night. I can tell it's a baby because the fur is very gray and the head looks too big for it. It's just like human babies have a proportionately larger head. Sorry for the green dot, I have to keep it out of the way. The baby horseshoe bats have proportionately bigger heads than the adults. And so the mother will come back and feed that one in sometime during the night and stay with it in the morning over the day. So moving on to the next group, this is the Hippocidaridae, also called roundleaf bats. And here's a close-up of the nose. You can see why we call them a roundleaf bat. Maybe it's more square than round, but it doesn't have all the points of the other horseshoe bats. Still a bit of a horseshoe shape in the front. Some people have called them roundleaf horseshoe bat. Excuse my cough. But it's simpler just to call them roundleaf bat. And that's the name I used in the field guide. Some people call them leaf-nosed bats, but the trouble is that same name, leaf-nosed bat, is used in the neotropics for unrelated bats. So they prefer the English name roundleaf bat. But Hipposiderus, hippos actually means horse, so it also means horseshoe bat in a different language. So it's Greek, I think. Yeah, Rhinolophus is pointy nose, I think. So the shape of this horseshoe, of this nose leaf, is again important for identification. So this one is Hipposiderus bicolor that has this fairly straight middle part. If I look at the next species, oops, I missed one. Sorry, got one out of order here. This one's bright orange, quite distinctive color. This is the one I wanted here. You can see this is more swollen, smaller, bigger ears. Somebody said these are difficult to identify. Yes, they are. It takes quite a bit of experience to be able to tell them apart. Fortunately, the echolocation calls are often different. And so if you have a bat detector and can measure the call, that can make them easier to identify. But also with practice, these small differences in the shape of what's called the internarial septum, this piece in between the nostrils, the size of the nose leaf, is it small? Does it cover the whole muzzle? You'll see some very different ones in a moment. The size of the ears, the proportionate size. Some have small ears, some are more rounded, some are more pointed. Here's another one with a very rounded one. This is Hipposiderus cineraceus from Madai, this particular individual with very big ears. This is Hipposiderus dorii. This one's distinctive. It's the smallest of the Hipposiderus. It doesn't have any bars here. I didn't show those in the previous one, but there's little ridges here on most species that are missing on this one. Small and dark, very small nose leaf. Big eyes. Even though people say, you know, bats are blind, they're certainly not blind. These bats can see quite well, certainly during the day. This is the same bat in flight. This is Hipposiderus galleritis. This is a species that's found commonly in some of the caves in Borneo. You can see that it has these flaps on the side of the nose leaf, one of the distinctive features. Another feature that distinguishes it from a closely related species, Hipposiderus turbinus, is the width of this median nose leaf. This is wider than the back part. The next one is in the close-up, but in this case, it's narrower. This is one of the other very common bats at Gomantong caves. There's probably another 100,000 of these, Hipposiderus turbinus. Both this one and galleritis occur there. But if you take pictures of bats flying in and out, you get lots of pictures of this one and very few of the other species. So again, These bats, like the horseshoe bats, echolocate through their nostrils. They have these big nose leaves, big ears to pick up the signals. This is Hippocyterus larvatus. It has 3 flaps on the side. The last one had 2. So these are the little subtle things you need to learn to identify these species. It's also much bigger. And this one is also found in Sarawak, but not in Sabah or Peninsular Malaysia. Sorry, it's in Peninsular Malaysia, but not in Sabah. Juliana will kick me if she could. This is one of the most unusual nose leaves in the Hippocyterus. It's got these big flaps all around it. This is Hippocyterus coxi, known only from parts of Sarawak and adjacent Kalimantan. Very poorly known species, possibly quite rare. This one was near Kuching a few years ago. And this is Hippocyterus ridleyi. This one's found in Peninsular Malaysia, Sabah. Again, not common, but it has a big disc in the middle of the nose leaf and big ears, very big nose leaf. So that just gives you an idea of some of the diversity. This is Hippocyterus diadema, the largest one in Borneo. It weighs, I'm going to get this wrong, has a forearm about 80, but has several flaps on the side, big pink and interesting distinctive color with white edges along here. And this one's flying into Komantong Caves in the morning. And another one which had obviously been feasting on flying ants and hadn't bothered to finish chewing and swallowing them before flying back to the cave. You can see the wings here sticking out of its mouth with the insects it's been eating. And what's interesting is the females of this one tend to be very orange. The babies are very gray. So you get this nice distinctive color contrast of a baby hanging on to the female. The baby's actually right side up or wrong side up, depending on what you think a bat should be. The female's hanging from the ceiling. The baby's clinging on to the false nipples at the base of on the mother and just spends the day there. When it wants to feed, it actually has to clamber down over her face to get the real nipples that are down on the breasts that have milk. So moving on from the horseshoe bats, we get to the false vampires. There's only 1 species in Borneo. There's 6 species in the world though. And so I will show you a little bit about a couple of the other species just as we go through. False vampires are big bats, relatively big bats. This is Megaderma spasma, the big wings. They eat mostly large insects and sometimes small vertebrates. So they will sometimes catch lizards or frogs, especially the other species. This one, the Bornean one, mostly feeds on large insects, but it mostly hunts them by listening to the sound of the insect itself. So if you're a big katydid or a big grasshopper and you're calling at night to try to attract a mate, you might attract the wrong thing and get eaten instead. So it's a trade-off. Do you call and get mates, or do you keep quiet and not get eaten? And it's a lose-lose situation for the noisy one. But these bats are very good. They have very broad wings. They can almost hover. They also have very good eyesight, quite big eyes, but huge ears that help them to hear the sound of their prey. This is a small group that was roosting the day in some old abandoned toilet houses at the Danau Girang field station, all staring at me as I take the picture. You can tell they have good eyesight. You can see they're looking at me wondering, what is that camera? Why is that person doing there taking my picture? Just to show you some of the other species, in Peninsular Malaysia or Thailand, there are 2 species. The one on the left is Megaderma spasma, the one that's found in Borneo. Has sort of a heart-shaped nose leaf here in the middle. Megaderma lyra, the larger one, has more of a spear shape up the middle. It doesn't have that dip on the heart. This one is truly predatory. It will eat small mice, even actually quite large mice, lizards, birds that it can find at night, and of course large insects, frogs as well. Frogs are another animal that likes to call a lot at night, but if it calls from the wrong place, it stops calling suddenly when it gets eaten. And just to show some diversity, I was in Africa 2 years ago and got a picture of the yellow-winged bat. another species in the same family, Megadermatidae. And they just roost in the daytime in these acacia trees out in the open. And they actually mostly catch insects that they fly up and catch at night, at dusk, not, but they're quite active during the day and keep their eyes out for people wandering around or predators. Snakes, hawks are all things to watch out for. So I mentioned there was only the one species in Borneo. So we then move on to the hollow-faced bats, also called slit-faced bats, Nycteridae. They get their name from a strange little nose leaf that has like a slit down the middle. And if you look at the skull, there's a big hollow area underneath here. It's probably a resonance chamber that has to do with the echolocation call. They also have big ears and big wings, broad tail. They also feed by catching big insects on the ground, or I don't think this species doesn't feed on vertebrates that we know, but some of the big Nycteris in Africa will also feed on mice or frogs or lizards. So they can also be predators of vertebrates. They have a very interesting tail, very long. It's almost as long as the body. I didn't mention, but the false vampires have no tail. They have a tail membrane, but no tail bone. This one has a long tail and has a distinctive Y shape at the end, almost a T shape. I don't think anybody knows why, but it's a very distinctive feature that only these Nycteris have. And there's only the one species in Sabah, but there's also quite a few species in Africa, and this is just one of the many African species. Unfortunately, I did not have a good African book on bats, so I don't know what species this was, but it was near in Tanzania. The sheath-tailed bats, we were talking about the black-bearded tomb bat that's in this family. This is a small species. Here, these ones, you can recognize them when you see them roosting because they always have their wings spread out and hooked on at either side, sort of like a triangle or almost a pyramid, and then with their nose sticking down. This is the lesser sheath-tailed bat. This particular one was actually in Thailand, but it looks the same as the one in Borneo. There's two species, they're very hard to tell apart. Here's one in flight. They get their name because the tail bone doesn't actually reach the end of the tail. It just goes a quarter of the way down. And when they're roosting, it actually sticks out the top, but I didn't take a picture of that. And now we're into bats that echolocate through their mouth. See, all the rest of the bats you see will have their mouth open while they're flying. And that's because they have to be shouting out their echolocation call and listening for the echoes to see where they're going. So their mouth is always open when they're flying. Here are your black-bearded tomb bats. These particular ones are in Thailand, but they look the same as the ones in Borneo. And you can just see on this one, this bit of a black streak here, which is where they get their name. They don't all have a black beard. Some have a black beard, some don't. You can see hiding underneath this one, this one, this one, that one, this one. There's some babies. There's some little gray babies just underneath there, if you've got a good screen. And so these are mostly females, obviously, with the babies next to them. The males usually don't stay with the babies. They don't have much milk to offer. The babies prefer the mothers. No bottles available for liberation there in the bat world. This is another species of tomb bat. I forget which, actually it might be the same one, but a different one, a different individual. And they have this interesting pocket in the edge of their wing. I don't think anybody knows quite what that's for. It might have something to do with the way they fly. Most of these tomb bats actually fly very high over the forest. All of the horseshoe bats I didn't mention mostly fly inside the forest. They're low flying, very maneuverable. They stick to the forest. The tomb bats fly high. Used to be able to see them over the towns. They roost in the buildings. They fly high. Sometimes you see big bats with translucent white wings flying high over a city in Malaysia. Those would be some of the tomb bats. The free-tailed bats, there's 4 species in Borneo. I just have pictures of one of them. It's the wrinkled bat. It's the most common bat. This is the one that forms the huge clouds of bats that fly out at night from Mulu or from Gomantong caves. There can be up to 1 million or more bats in some of these roosts. They get their name, as you can see from this bat, by the wrinkles along its lip. They have a tail that sticks out the end, as you see in this one, sticking out here. These are also high-flying bats. They may fly 20 or 30 kilometers every night to catch insects. And when you have 1 million bats flying out of a cave, this just shows a couple thousand, but imagine that times 50 or 100 or 1,000 times more than what you see here. And that's what you can see flying out of some of these caves. Big numbers of them, quite spectacular in the evening. And if you've ever watched them coming out, there's also lots of hawks and eagles, especially the bat hawk, that take advantage of this and come and see how quickly they can catch a meal. The specialist is the bat hawk. They have big eyes, very good eyesight. I once watched a bat hawk catch 8 bats in 5.5 minutes, at which point it slowed down a lot because I think it was getting full. But it would catch a bat, swallow it, it catches it in its feet, stops for a moment, transfers the bat to its mouth, swallows it whole, and then goes for another one. I saw 20 seconds in between 2 catches one time. So these bats go in big crowds. It's sort of for safety, but it also invites visitors to come and get a meal from them. So now we move on to a group called the bentwing bats. They're very similar to the last group we'll get to, the Vespertilionids, in appearance. There are 6 species. They all look the same. Some are bigger, some are smaller. The distinctive feature for those who are technical experts is they have a short bone here and a very long one here, whereas most of the other bats, this bone and this bone are not quite equal, but much closer to the same size. This one's about 1/3 the length. They, again, are very common at Gomantong and some of the caves. I think there's probably, again, over 100,000 of this particular species at Gomantong caves. And so I got lots of pictures of them flying in and out of the cave, doing some fun maneuvers. Rid of my green dot. Again, just point out, flying with their mouth open, they echolocate through their mouth. So all the different species, they look a bit different. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but they're very closely related. Now we finally get to the last family, the Vespertilionidae. This is the one family of bats found on every continent except Antarctica. No bats there. This is the genus Myotis that's also found on every continent. And they all tend to look pretty similar. Distinctive bats, echolocate through their mouth, of course. There's 10 species known from Borneo. There may be more. This particular species is interesting, the Horsfield's Myotis, because they sometimes catch small fish. They fly low over the water. They have big feet. Some have much bigger feet. I'll show another one, but I don't have a picture of the feet. And they will usually scoop insects off the surface of the water. They echolocate, they detect insects that are coming out, mayflies or whatever on the water, and then they catch them. But they sometimes even catch small fish. There's another one flying into Gomantong caves. A few, maybe 10,000 in Gomantong caves. I'm just guessing the number. It's very hard to count them there. This is another Myotis. This one sometimes roosts in rolled up bamboo leaves. Not bamboo, rolled up banana leaves. Young banana leaves, when the leaves just coming out, they'll sleep inside that. This is the Macrotarsus, the big-footed Myotis. This one definitely catches fish. This one's also found in Sabah. Very distinctive color. Ridley eye, a much smaller one. Mostly feeds on small insects that it catches in flight. Myotis borneoensis, a distinctive species only found in Borneo. Lots of these different types of Myotis. just looking at the clock, so I'm going a little bit faster. This is the tube-nosed bat, Murininae. There's only 5 species in Borneo, but there's nearly 20 species in mainland Southeast Asia, many described recently. Hotspot of diversity in Indochina. So there may be more species than we know about in Borneo as well. This is Myotis Murina peninsularis. They have this distinctive tubular nostrils. I don't think anybody really knows why. Quentin Phillips put some nice stories or guesswork into his field guide to the mammals of Borneo, but they're just guesses. Nobody really knows why they have these tubular nostrils on either side. They don't feed on fruit. Sometimes people think, well, if they're feeding on fruit, that they have their nose in mushy fruit, then it helps them breathe, but they don't. They feed on insects. So I don't think we know why they have these nostrils sticking out either side. But the different species differ in color. This one's very orange. This one's more of a brown and white. This is Murina suila. They have very distinctive hairy feet. They're very hairy, the Murina, and hairs all down their wings. Again, peninsularis. This one's got gold tips, Murina, bronzed tube-nosed bat. And this is the hairy wing bat that has super hairy all over its wing membrane, tail membrane, and it's quite a bit larger, orange or brown. Archaeocephalus. The Carabulinae, these are my favorites. These are some of the smallest bats in the world. This one's a clear wing bat. You can see how its wings are almost transparent. My favorite picture. It's beautiful orange. There's one called the painted bat in Thailand that looks like this, except the wing membranes in between are big splotches of black. So it's black and orange, like a Halloween bat. But this one's, I think, is just as pretty. And I haven't caught the other one, so I can't take a picture. This is the tiniest bat in Borneo. Only weighs 2 grams, a little ball of fluff. It may look big because it's so fluffy, but when you weigh it, it's less than most coins. Carabula minuta. Here's one flying around. This one's Carabula intermedia. It looks almost the same, but it's about 50% bigger, weighs about 3 grams. So still very small, but not as small as minuta. This one is Carabula hardwicki. You may have heard about a bat that roosts inside pitcher plants, inside nepenthes. This is that bat. This I've never seen it in a nepenthes, but apparently they will roost inside some of the big nepenthes pitchers, and they fertilize the plant with their droppings. So instead of the pitcher plant having to catch insects to get excuse me, to get nitrogen, it relies on the bat's droppings. So it provides a home for the bat, and in return, the bat gives it some deposits to help provide it with nitrogen as fertilizer. This is the Phoniscus, the gilded bat, very closely related. I should point out these Carabula have some of the highest frequency echolocation calls. Some parts of their echolocation calls go over 200 kilohertz, so typically between 1 and 200 kilohertz. They fly very slowly. They're catching small insects. I believe that they're thought to be able to pick up insects. They're sitting in on a surface, on a leaf. Their echolocation is so precise they can detect the differences. Some species specialize in grabbing spiders off spider webs. So the spider sets its web to catch insects, but gets caught instead by the bat. I think the Phoniscus is thought to catch spiders as well. Another species of Phoniscus. This one's a female. You can see it's lactating. You can see the big mammary glands there. Must have a young one back in a roost somewhere. Usually the insect-eating bats don't fly with their young because it would be too hard to catch insects and maneuver. And then finally, we get to the last group, the Vespertilianinae. This particular one is a bamboo bat. These are also very tiny bats. They weigh anywhere around 2.5 to 4 grams. And they roost inside some of the big bamboos. Apparently they can get through a slit that's only 3.5 millimeters wide. So if you take your ruler next time and see how small that is, you realize how flat these bats can flatten themselves to squeeze through. To move inside the bamboo, they have these pads on their thumb and a pad on their foot. So remember the Myotis foot I showed you had long claws, no particular ankle. This one has a big pad. So you can imagine the inside of a bamboo is quite smooth. This allows them to grip, to scurry up and down inside the bamboo. And they have little tiny claws. These ones fly around catching insects. This is a greater bamboo bat. And I think this one's the lesser, but they look almost the same. This is a related bat, or not related, but a similar ecology bat. This is the thick thumb pipistrelle, very different shaped head, but also has a thickened thumb pad, not quite the same, and a thickened foot pad, and it also roosts inside bamboos. And here's one in flight. As you can see that pink thumb pad here, the foot twisted the other way. Again, flying with its mouth open, catching insects in flight. Asperoptus, another bat that has quite different teeth, different shape, but often to study bats, you need to get much closer. Finally, another species that I described many years ago, Areolulus cuprosus. And this is a related one, a much better picture, not found in Borneo, unfortunately. This one is from Thailand, Areolulus societatis. Beautiful golden tipped furs, beige edges to the ears. And here's a picture of one in flight. Now, finally, I'm just going to close with a couple of pictures showing you how do we study bats? How did I get all these pictures? So the main method we use to catch a lot of these bats are either a harp trap or a mist net. This is a harp trap. Typically, it's a frame. It's got some fishing line. Maybe on this particular picture, you can see the fishing line. It's vertical fishing line here. Again, I never know with Zoom what different people's monitors look like, but hopefully you can see that there's a lot of fishing line here. What happens is the bat is flying down the path at night. It hits the trap. It tries to get through, but there's 4 layers of fishing line. So it's like an obstacle course. It ends up sliding down in between the line and lands in this bag, which has plastic flaps on the side. Some of them manage to escape, but a lot of them then end up stuck in there, waiting for the bat researcher to come along and pick them out in the evening after they get caught. The other method we use to catch bats is mist nets. They work well for fruit bats and sometimes for insect-eating bats. But one thing I didn't mention is insect-eating bats have very small, sharp teeth that are extremely good at chewing holes in mist nets. So if you leave the bat in the net for more than a few minutes, you have a nice big hole and no bat. So in this case, we were catching bats at night that fly along the river. I'm standing in the river waiting for the bats to fly in. As soon as I see one or hear one flapping, I run over and grab it before it escapes and makes too big a hole in the net. Sometimes we want to catch bats higher up. This is showing Rodrigo Medellin, the Batman of Mexico. If you've ever watched National Geographic, he's done a few features on bats. Not the photographs, but just stories about him. And he was setting a very tall net that we raised up about 15 meters up into the canopy here. The most interesting thing we caught here was actually a small flying squirrel. Chavez was quite jealous of my picture of that flying squirrel. I don't have it in this show, but we did catch a few bats there as well. So just a variety of the ways. Of course, you need to be working with a researcher. You need your research permits and everything else to do this. So unfortunately, it's not good just for a hobby. For me now, I'm not doing active research. So I find some friendly person who is doing active research who would love to have an assistant that I can come along and take pictures of bats or see what they're doing, which is what I've done recently. So just to take some of these pictures of bats in flight, some of the ones you saw, I actually took in the wild at Gomentong Caves, but other ones, we caught the bat, we let it fly around inside my studio, which is just a portable tent, a portable like this. And I'll just show one more picture inside that, full of camera flashes and cameras. I was actually using 2 different cameras and 6 flashes. And then there's an infrared trip beam that reflects off. So there's a reflector up here, a beam down here. You let go of the bat, it flies through the beam, and it triggers all the flashes, and hopefully you get a nice picture. Actually, you take about 100 pictures and you get about 5 good pictures out of every 100, because sometimes it misses the target. There's lots of things go wrong. But good thing about digital camera is that you just waste a few electrons instead of a lot of films. That's where those pictures came from. And finally, this is Gomentong Caves, where if you want to see bats without disturbing them, this or Mulu are 2 of the best places to see lots of bats. But of course, there's bats all over Borneo, in the forests everywhere, in the towns, in the villages, roosting. If you're out in the evening, you can see bats. Not always easy to tell what they are, but 100 species of mammals just for bats is quite impressive. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, for this lovely talk and sharing your experiences of bats in Borneo and to abandoned toilets and and everything. No, I love that. I learned so much. I mean, the details you have to look at of the bones, of the face and everything, how many lines, this and that. This is amazing. I actually have myself a million questions, but I can always email you. So let's see what other people have first. So everybody, if you have any questions, you can either put in the chat box or just raise your hand or unmute yourself now and just ask away. Thanks again, Charles.
Charles, I would like to know briefly your experience on the bat bite, please.
On bat bites, being bitten by bats?
Yeah, that's what you said earlier on. You missed.
Oh, yes.
By
well,
that.
If you're a very good, diligent researcher, you wear nice leather gloves and make sure the bats don't bite you. When you're old like me, you don't worry about that. And yes, I do get bitten. Now, would I worry more knowing what certain viruses came from bats recently that are causing trouble all over the world? Maybe I should. Of course, I've had rabies vaccination, which is the most dangerous virus that we know that bats carry. So it is a wise idea to be trying to wear gloves when you can. It's just when you're holding a 2-gram bat or taking them out of a net, it's not easy to maneuver with gloves. So it's best not to get bitten, but I will admit I've been bitten by many, many species of bats. I'm much more careful with the ones with really big teeth. The 2-gram bats don't actually break the skin, so it's not a problem. Yes, the people who study viruses, they wear fancy suits and big thick gloves. But the people who study bats are slightly less fussy.
Thanks for the question, Jill. Anybody else?
I will add that if you take pictures of bats flying in and out of the cave, you don't have to get bitten at all because you don't touch the bats. You just let them take their own picture. But it's tricky to find a good spot where you can set up all your cameras and flashes that the bats will fly over the right place.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
You earlier described the bat that was similar to the one in Philippines, but you then described it as a separate species. I'm curious about the habitat of this bat.
Okay, that one is the white-collared fruit bat. And the one in
Philippines.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the one in the Peninsula Malaysia and Borneo appears to be mostly in the canopy of mature forest.
Okay,
but
so very high up.
Very high up. It has been caught in Karangas forest, which is much lower forest. But that might be because they're easier to catch, not because they're more in the Karangas forest. Because when the canopy is lower, there's more chance that the bat will be low enough to catch in the net. But the ones that I caught in Peninsula Malaysia, I actually had, that was in a canopy net, which I was hanging from a tall branch. So the net was probably 25 meters above the ground. quite high up.
Thank you.
Anybody else would like to go?
Hi, Charles. Julie here. I have a
Hi,
question.
Julie.
Hi. I have a question about some quite rare species that occur in Borneo. It's called Rhinolophus proconsalis, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah,
And
I've never seen it. Go ahead.
No, the question is because that species is listed as endangered, and I think it's reported from Sarawak. And I asked the author what is the difference, because they say it's similar to aquatus. So do you know if that actually overlapping species? Because I heard that there is no aquatus from Sabah.
Well, Rhinolophus, it was considered a subspecies of Arcuatus. So it was Rhinolophus arcuatus proconsalis. And somebody was doing genetic work, I think, and decided that Arcuatus was a different species that does not occur in Borneo, as far as I know. So proconsalis would be the name of the closest of the species that occurs in Borneo. So it's not that it's a different species from Arcuatus in Borneo. There's only the one species in Borneo. I haven't read the paper that separated them, or at least not recently, so I don't remember what the differences were. I don't think it was a genetic study because I don't think there's any genetics available for the Borneo form, proconsalis. I think it was a morphology study, unless you know more than I do, which you might.
Okay. Any further comments, questions? Anybody? Charles, you saw on some of your pictures of some of the fruit bats, you saw maybe some of the seeds on the wings. And yes, the bats love eating ficus, figs as well. Did you ever make a list of fig species you have seen them eat ever?
Nope, because I don't know the different species of figs.
or the trees maybe.
Yeah, no, mostly, actually, I did most of my work on the insect-eating bats. I mean, we caught some fruit bats, but I think the most species that I saw were the ones with the harp traps, because that type of harp trap with the 4 layers of fishing line was sort of my invention. I mean, other people made 2, so it's not a big invention to add 2 more layers, but I found that it worked very well for Caravula and Murina, which used to be thought to be really rare. When I started work in Borneo, there was almost no records for any Caravula, just a few individuals that somebody had found by accident roosting in a leaf. And as Julie would know from working with harp traps in Peninsular Malaysia, they're actually one of the most common bats in the understory, but they're so good at missing mist nets. So they become mist nets in the other form. They missed the net, M-I-S-S-E-D, but they don't miss harp traps. So they're quite, so I did less work on fruit bats.
Okay.
I used less nets, except that bit with the canopy work. So a nice little story. But when you're netting in the understory of the rainforest, because I was also working on birds, you catch very few fruit bats, just a few Cynopterus and a spotted wing fruit bat.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I have one more question.
Yes.
I'm sorry for being like.
No, sure. Please.
So this is about the bamboo bats, and I think probably can help us, especially the researcher from that work in both the Peninsula and the Borneo. Recently, the bamboo bats from Peninsula have been separated from the one in Borneo. So do you see any morphological differences? Because most of the reported differences is from the genetic work. But I mean, because you work in both area and often seeing it for a long time, do you see any differences at all?
They look the same to me. In fact, even just telling the 2 species in the same place together can be challenging. So there's the lesser bamboo bat and the greater bamboo bat. And what Juliana is talking about is that the species of lesser bamboo bat and greater bamboo bat in Peninsular Malaysia are now recognized as different. So there's a Borneo lesser bamboo bat and a Borneo greater bamboo bat and a peninsular one as well. The English names are slightly different, and they're very hard to tell apart. And in Vietnam, there's thought to be a third species that you actually cannot tell apart except with DNA. So I do sometimes wonder with some of those, if somebody does more research and will discover, oops, they are actually the same thing. But right now, the evidence is that there are 3 species in Vietnam, 2 in Borneo, 2 in Peninsular Malaysia, but the ones in Borneo and Peninsular Malaysia are different, but they look very similar. So they're obviously related, and they've probably diverged. I don't know what the best guess is, maybe 100,000 years or 1 million years ago. And so now they're genetically distinct, but they look very similar. Their ecology is still the same. The problem is, the challenge is that there's variation within individual bats as well. So I'm just going to answer a question from the chat log. Actually, I'll answer the most recent one first about oil palm estates. I don't think any of the fruit bats will eat oil palm. I think it's too hard and too heavy for them. Rodents certainly do, so mice and rats will eat the oil palm, but I don't think that any of the fruit bats do. And in fact, oil palm estates are not very good for bats. They're pretty close to deserts for bats. There's not so many insects. They don't have good roosting sites. I'm sure there are some species fly through them, but especially a clean oil palm estate with no other species is really a bit of a biological desert compared to the natural forests.
Even when they cut down the palm oil, like when they're doing a new, what's the word? When they're cutting down basically new plot to replant again, there are lots of insects usually then, that during that short brief period. Do you think there are a lot of bats coming then?
Well, it's not a lot of shelter for them though. So the species that feed within the forest, it wouldn't be ideal because they normally feed in cluttered areas. But the open country bats might go through, I don't know. I have a question in the chat log about rabies vaccine, but I got mine in Canada, so I can't answer those questions. It's quite easy to get the rabies vaccine in Canada because every veterinary has to get regular boosters every year. So, and rabies is rare in bats in North America. Well, it's rare in bats everywhere, but there are other animals like skunks and raccoons that have rabies more frequently. So the medical clinics all have it available.
Any more questions by anybody?
Well, I have an invitation to visit Brunei, but I have to next get to Malaysia. I have to next get to Asia, so I would love to.
So Charles, you have to visit us in Tawau, and then you have to go to Brunei, or vice versa. Yes, have some fun. I have a few more questions, but I'll ask one by one. So people come to Borneo to see mammals, especially lots of tourists. They go to Danam Valley, they go to Tawau, they go to Dramakot, they go to Kuching and everything to see all kind of mammals. Yeah, but they don't always try to look for bats. Some want to look for bats, but they can't find them somehow, or some just don't know much about it. Is there any way we can get either the travel companies or even mammal watchers, because mammal watchers would be interested because they're already coming to Borneo to see other kind of mammals and they just want to have a good checklist. Is there any way to get people more involved in bats? Are there other more sites or ways to look for bats? Any comments?
Well, the big challenge with studying bats is that to really identify them, most species you need to capture them or get a really good photograph. All the pictures I got flying in and out of Gomantong caves, I could identify from the photographs. But if I just see the bats flying, the flying foxes, they're easy. The big flying foxes or the island flying fox, you can identify those without catching them. But there's not that many species that are easy to identify. So that's a bit of a challenge from a distance. For mammal tourism, people want to know what species was it, but it's hard to identify without catching. But in places to see them, of course, the big caves are spectacular because even if you don't know what all the species are, Gomantong caves that I showed at the end, I won't bother sharing back again, but you know, if you've been to Gomantong, there's the big cave entrance at the top. There's the cave entrances at the front. Different species are flying through different parts of the cave. The free-tailed bats are flying out the top in these big clouds that I showed. The horseshoe bats are flying along the edge, disappearing into the forest. The Krieg's horseshoe bat, the fawn roundleaf bat, Epicedrus cervinus, the bent-winged bats, the Neopterus, the Myotis. So there's probably 20 species in Gomantong caves, of which about 7 or 8 are quite common, and the rest are much harder to find.
Yes.
But
Okay.
most of the species of bats are single bats that you see in the forest. All the Caravula, the Murina, they roost hollow trees, clumps of leaves. So quite difficult to study. But there are opportunities. Toilet blocks at Danong Gerang is a great place to see Megaderma and Rhinolophus underneath the house. The tomb bats, couple of others that roost in houses sometimes. There's a lot of variety. So you need a bat expert to be taking people, but it's still hard to see more than a few species unless you're doing research or catching them.
Yeah.
You really should only be catching them if you're doing research, because you need somebody who's got the right permissions to do that type of work. So
Yeah. Question in the chat box? Yes, Juliana.
Oh no, I just want to add, what is your opinion in using a bat detector for tourism?
Sorry, that's a really good point. I think that is another option. We don't have a full call library, but I'm sure there are some expert researchers like you who are helping to build that call library. So that is actually something I was forgetting about, that many of these insect-eating bats can be identified with bat detectors, especially the horseshoe bats, the roundleaf bats, the tomb bats, and the pipistrelles and things that fly quite high, Areolus. The Murina and Caravula, the problem is that their echolocation calls are so faint that you need to be within 2 meters of the bat to actually pick it up with a bat detector. But that is possible. Of course, if they're flying around, you can put your bat detector down there and then you can look to see what happens. So the wide availability of fairly low-cost bat detectors, there are now quite a few bat detectors that you can plug into your iPhone and see the signal on your iPhone or on your Android. So Juliana raises a really good point that there are options to identify the bats, not every species. And I missed one that I didn't have a picture, so I didn't put it in, but the naked bat, which is like those wrinkle-lip bats, but 10 times the size. They're huge. They're quite easy to identify. And people of the right age, which used to be me, but I'm not sure anymore, can hear their echolocation calls because they have part of the call that's around 12 kilohertz.
Charles and Juliana, are there like apps you can recommend for people who just want to get into a bit of bat work? And do you need speakers, very expensive speakers, or like this kind of microphone? Sorry, this is I think
yeah,
simple.
you need a specialized microphone, because that microphone is good for audible frequencies, but it doesn't go above the 20 kilohertz. So you need a bat detector. But you'd have to look it up. They're somewhere between, well, this is going to be US dollars probably, but $200 to $400 US. You can get a bat detector, maybe less. I mean, you can get expensive ones, but I mean, bear in mind that some of the phones people are playing with cost 3 times that much. So Samsung S10 is not a cheap phone.
Yes.
So I think there are some that are a couple of $100s. Did you know, Juliana, that some of the ones that plug into phones?
Oh, I think nowadays we can get ultrasound microphone. So instead of recording, because for like tourism, they're not really interested in doing the recording, so they can just plug in the microphone, the high frequency microphone. So you can actually hear it without recording it. So much more, a little bit cheaper.
Okay, so there are some options. You could look up what they are. I have a couple.
Nice. There are a few questions in the chat box by Puan and Yok Mui. Charles?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll answer them well in reverse order. The bats flying out of Gomantong and Mulu, there's many different species, but they're flying differently. So the ones that form the big clouds that you see flying into the sky, that's just one species. That's the wrinkle-lipped bat. But if you look closely near the edge of the cave, there's many more species that are flying into the forest. So there's just the one species that flies very high before it's completely dark and forms those big clouds of bats, the wrinkle-lipped, but many others that are flying. And after dark, they're flying all over the place. Many species wait till dark. Question about bat with the wing torn. Bats can heal their wings remarkably well. But of course, if the wing is torn so badly it can't fly, then it will have trouble because, but if it has a small tear, if it has a hole in the wing, those will heal quite quickly. And that's something that unfortunately people have been studying a lot in North America, because there's this disease called white nose syndrome. It's a fungus that was introduced from Europe into North America. The European bats are immune to it. The North American ones are not. And it can kill up to 95% of the bats in an area. If they survive the winter, because this fungus grows in the winter when it's cold, the bats are hibernating, then they often have badly damaged wings. But as long as they can just fly enough to get food, then their wings heal. And so we see a lot of bats that have fully healed wings that we know had badly damaged wings earlier. But of course, if the wing is so badly torn, the bat can't fly, it's not going to be able to catch food.
So is it advisable to put it out of its misery and just kill it?
Probably, or depends where it is, or leave it to natural, whatever happens to it. It's probably not advisable to pick it up, because sometimes the reason a bat is injured and on the ground is because it's sick. So you want to be especially careful with sick bats, in case they're carrying a disease. Hopefully not COVID. But the best place to catch COVID is from your friends and neighbors, not from the bats right now. But diseases like rabies and there may be other diseases you don't want to get from bats. So it is important to be careful when handling any mammal, not just bats.
Okay. And another question is, what is the protection status of bats in Peninsula and Borneo, Sabah, and Sarawak?
I think Juliana could answer that one better than me.
So probably I can help a little bit. For Peninsular Malaysia, we have, for global, we do have the IUCN status for all those bats. And that protection, the status goes with the protection with the endangered and thing like that. Particularly for Peninsula, we do have, they call it red mammal list for Peninsular Malaysia. They revised, and the recent one is in 2010. And for Sabah and Sarawak, they have different enactment. For Borneo, Sabah and Sarawak have a different enactment as well. So the bats actually protected under that enactment, and also the Wildlife Act. That's what I know.
Thanks, Juliana. And there's hope that we might get more protections. The ones that are most at risk are the flying foxes, the terapus, and they're not as well protected as they might be. They may, even when they're protected, the enforcement is a problem from too much hunting. So those big flying foxes, it's really sad to know that there used to be hundreds of thousands or millions, and maybe now there's just a few thousand or a few tens of thousands left scattered across Borneo. So there's a ecology question here in the chat about bats only in Sabah or only in Sarawak. Actually, the ones I know about are only in Sarawak and not in Sabah. Some of it might be just because we haven't studied them enough, but there seem to be some ecology differences. I don't think it's corridors. There are a number of birds that have a different subspecies in Sarawak and Sabah, which is surprising because we think of it as all continuous forest. I don't know what would stop that, but for example, the shama, if any of you know that very popular singing bird, the white-rumped shama, in Sabah it has a white crown, and in Sarawak it has a black crown. So it's, some people call it a separate species, but it's basically the same species or same form, but one is found in Sarawak, one is found in Sabah, and I don't think anybody knows why. There's one of the bulbils, the yellow-bellied bulbul, also there's a different, I think one has a yellow tail band in Sarawak and not in Sabah. So there are a few bats that actually do differ. Most of them are found in both places. But that Hippoceterus coxi with a really big nose, the round-leaf bat with a very elaborate nose, is just known from Sarawak and adjacent parts of Kalimantan, I think has now been found. I think some of the others, when we do more research, we may discover, oh, they're found also elsewhere. So that white-colored fruit bat has not yet been found in Sabah, but I would not be at all surprised. Well, now you never know. So much forest has disappeared that maybe it used to be found in Sabah. But hopefully it's still left in some of the big patches. There's still a few nice patches of forest, of course, around Danam and where the reserves are. That's just so sad to see so much that has disappeared and been turned into oil palm. And I'm sure they are not in the oil palm, except by accident on their way somewhere else.
Do you think Mount Kinabalu have played anything at all in their ecology?
It could. I don't know of any bats that are only found on the high mountains. There are some birds found only on Kinabalu and Trusmadi, the nearby one. But I don't know. Bats tend to be less high montane specialists. Ethalops is one of the few that's a mountain specialist. Maybe Francis's woolly bat, who knows? It's the only record for Sabah is from, no, it's found in Kalimantan as well, so I'm wrong on that. The only Sabah record was from Trusmadi, where I caught one in 1984.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Charles, just another question. I have many more, but I'll email you some. But one of them is, sounds like a nonsense question, but do big fireworks, do they affect bats? Can they kill bats with like a big loud bang and everything? Like stress them out?
I would think not. I don't think there's much risk. They might, well, for example, the fireworks in Sydney Harbour probably annoy all the fruit bats that roost in Australia, that roost in the botanical gardens, but I think it's, might scare them. They might fly around, but normally I think they would ignore it. Obviously, if there was a complete accident and the bat was flying by just when a firework exploded, well, we can guess what would happen, but that would be quite a fluke for a bat to be sticking around in a firework display. It's like, seagulls getting hit by a baseball. When it happens, you hear about it, but it's a pretty rare event.
No, it's just like dolphins, sometimes they die because of the echolocations, maybe by container ships and everything.
Yeah.
And so I just thought maybe if the noise pollution.
But I think the sound transmission of some of the sonar underwater is so much louder. Like some of those ships are using very, very high volume, and it would cause us to have a concussion if we were near some of that sonar. So it's not surprising. Whereas I think a firework for a bat, especially because the noise of the firework is probably not in the same frequency as their sensitive range. It's much lower. That's the other problem with the sonar underwater for dolphins is it's very loud in their frequency range.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So any more final questions by anybody? Okay, if anybody does have any, you can ask or you can put in the chat box. I just want to say thank you so much, Charles, for your wonderful talk. We'll answer the question after this. I just want to do some shameless advertising quickly, guys. There'll be a talk at 2 p.m. On the Borneo Dolphin Project by Chun Sing Wong, and then there'll be some other talks tomorrow, mammals of Danam Valley, mammals of Toraja and Brunei, and then day after tomorrow, after that, it will be mammals of Tawau. So yeah, 2 p.m., which is 1 hour, 30 minutes from now, you can have lunch after this or dinner or supper or wherever you guys are, a beer, anything. And just want to advertise that. And also you can join the Facebook group, Borneo Mammals Club, to get more information. Okay. Yeah, there's another question, Charles, in the chat box.
That's a good question about light pollution. In some places, lights are actually good for bats, because lights attract insects, and then you see bats coming to fly around the lights and eat all the insects that are around the lights. So for example, back when there was a lot more forest around some parts of Kinabalu that are now more open, the street lights at the edge there, we'd see a lot of bats flying around the street lights in the evening, catching the insects that are attracted to the lights. But when you have a big area of light, I think that effect is less beneficial. It might make the bats more vulnerable to predators, but I don't know. There's probably less predators around the big cities. So it's uncertain how much the light pollution will affect them. It probably has some effect, but it's not as bad as it might be for, say, migrating birds that get confused on their orientation, I think. But it's an area of research. I know some people are trying to understand how cities are affecting bats, because in villages, they were great for bats. They had, thatch houses, thatch roof. There's lots of bats will roost in it. But when you get into high rises with concrete ceilings and no attic, then they're not so good for bats anymore for them to roost. So, the old buildings were great. The new buildings are not so good. So it's quite complicated to know how cities will affect bats.
Bats tend to roost in cool. What do you mean, Ala?
In which, sorry?
You're mute.
So I was wondering, because we live in a condo here. It's maybe 30 years old. We've got lots of, now from your talk, I believe they're the smallest kind of bats, really small. And we have goosehawks hanging around sometimes to pick them out at dusk. Not often seen, the goosehawk, but the bats come in and out. And they tend to roost at nearly every little gap because we see them flying out from the gap. So I was wondering, maybe the newer ones are too flat, but there's some with little gaps that I do see the bats coming out in the condo. So
that's true.
Maybe there might be a way to live with them.
Yeah, actually, that's true. I should have been thinking more because when I was with Juliana last year and a half ago, whenever on the campus in UPM, there were plenty of bats roosting in some of the buildings that are on the campus. And yeah, as long as there's a crack or hole, these would mostly be the pipistrelles. I did not have many pictures of those. They would be related to that colorful one that my last bat, but usually smaller and darker brown. There's several species, the house bat, Scytophilus, quite a few species. They're ones I haven't caught as often because they fly high. And so when you're setting your traps and your nets down on the ground, you don't catch them the same way. But they would be the ones that are likely to be in the buildings. And yes, those 30-year-old buildings, older buildings, they're perfect for having little gaps under the roof, little cracks behind things. And a lot of these bats, and these are the ones that feed in the open, so they don't depend on the forest. They're feeding on the insects that are flying high. What they depend on is not too many pesticides, because if there's too much pesticide, then there's no prey base. But
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
And their favorite bats are insects.
Fantastic.
Sorry, their favorite insects would be things like flying termites. Termites are like flying meals for these bats. They're
That's
fat and juicy.
That's good. So it's not just pangolins trying to control the termites, but also the bats, the insect-borne bats. That's awesome. It's good to know, especially when we do this education stuff. Okay. Any final questions, comments? Anybody? This is it. Okay, there is one more.
Well, how to get rid of bats that you don't want in your building? The only really good way to get rid of them is to figure out how they're getting into the building and to block off the entrance. Some of these really open buildings, it's best just to put up with them. I mean, what you really want to do is teach people how wonderful the bats are, and so that they enjoy having something that eats the insects and that they can see. It's not always easy because people just don't like something messy on the ground, but sometimes it's worth it to try to persuade people that they're just fascinating creatures. Teach them more about bats, and maybe they'll be more tolerant. Of course, you don't want them inside your apartment. You want them outside your apartment. And so, sometimes it's just a question of keeping the gaps where they crawl in blocked off. So make sure that there's screens or something or closed off the places they can get into your room. Of course, if you have your window open at night, it's not likely they will fly in, and if they do, they'll probably fly out again. It's mostly bats that crawl in somewhere. They keep going, they find another crack, and suddenly they found a crack that lets them inside your apartment. In that case, it's best to show them the doorway and try to close off the hole. But I think if they're roosting outside under the roof, I think that's perfect. You just need to teach people how wonderful they are instead. That they're not rodents, they're not rats, they're not mice. They eat insects. They don't eat your food.
Yeah. Charles, maybe we can write an article in English and then can be translated in Malay, could be used in the papers and also in social media, maybe just saying importance of bats, and just because some of your pictures of them gulping those insects and how important they are for the fruits like durian and everything. Just a simple article. Let's say 5 reasons why you should be friends with bats or something like that. You know, and with the pictures, I think that will make a big impact. And we have the social media connections, and other people can do that too. And we can share it in to local groups, WhatsApp groups, school groups, so on. So yeah, maybe we can discuss this as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's a few people working on some of those types of things, so I can share some links as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay.
So can Juliana. She's part of that group.
Awesome. So yeah, okay, maybe we'll get in touch on that later. So any more final questions, comments, anybody? Okay, Mala is typing something maybe. No, okay, she's yeah. Okay. In that case, I just want to say again, thank you so much, Charles, for your time, and time for you to maybe have a bedtime wine and sleep. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And we'll get in touch again. If anybody has questions, can get in touch with us. And yeah, and thank you so much again, Charles. And yes.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. It was fun to put this together.
Welcome. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. All right, guys. So take care. Time for lunch, dinner, supper for some people. And so take care.
And breakfast for at least one, I think, from UK.
Breakfast, yeah. Daisy's having her breakfast maybe soon.